In the scorching desert of 1882 Arizona Territory, where mercy was scarcer than water and survival meant killing or being killed, one moment of human compassion would change everything. When cattle rancher Jake Morrison stumbled bleeding and half-dead into an Apache camp, he expected to meet his maker. Instead, two young Apache girls would risk their own lives to save his, marking him with sacred symbols that would later become his shield against certain death. What happened next would challenge everything the Old West believed about enemies, friendship, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. This is the true story of how ancient Apache wisdom saved a cowboy's life, and how that cowboy's courage saved two innocent girls from a fate worse than death. Jake Morrison wiped the sweat from his brow as he guided his horse through the rocky canyon trails of southeastern Arizona. The year was 1882, and the territory was still wild, dangerous, and unforgiving. Jake had been tracking cattle rustlers for 3 days, following their trail deeper into Apache country than any sensible man would venture alone. But Jake wasn't known for being sensible. At 28, he was already considered one of the best trackers in the territory, with a reputation for bringing back stolen cattle and, sometimes, the men who took them. The morning sun beat down mercilessly as Jake's horse picked its way carefully through the scattered boulders and thorny mesquite. His water was running low, and his horse was showing signs of fatigue. Still, the trail was fresh. The rustlers couldn't be more than a few hours ahead. Jake had invested everything he owned in his small ranch, and losing 20 head of cattle would mean financial ruin. He pressed on. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, Jake heard voices echoing off the rock walls. He dismounted quickly and crept forward on foot, leaving his horse tied to a sturdy juniper tree. Peering over a ridge, he saw what he was looking for. 3 men sat around a small fire, their faces familiar from wanted posters in town. The Martinez brothers and their partner, a mean-spirited drifter named Black Pete Williams. His cattle grazed nearby in a small meadow, still bearing his brand. Jake studied the camp carefully. The men appeared relaxed, confident they hadn't been followed this deep into hostile territory. Black Pete was cleaning his rifle while the Martinez brothers shared a bottle of whiskey. Jake counted 6 horses, meaning they expected to meet others soon. He needed to act fast. Drawing his Colt revolver, Jake made his way down the slope, using the rocks and brush for cover. His plan was simple: get close enough to get the drop on them, tie them up, and drive his cattle back to safer ground. But, as he moved closer, his boot kicked loose a small stone that clattered down the hillside. Black Pete's head snapped up instantly. "Someone's out there," he hissed, grabbing his rifle. Jake had no choice but to reveal himself. "Drop your weapons," he shouted, stepping into view with his gun drawn. "You're under citizen's arrest for cattle theft." The 3 rustlers scrambled for cover behind rocks and their saddles. Black Pete's rifle cracked, and Jake felt the bullet whine past his ear. He dove behind a boulder as more shots rang out. The gunfight that followed was fierce but brief. Jake was outnumbered but had better cover and was the superior marksman. When the smoke cleared, Black Pete lay motionless behind his saddle. One of the Martinez brothers clutched a wounded shoulder, while the other had disappeared entirely. Jake approached carefully, his gun still drawn. "Where's your brother?" Jake demanded, keeping the wounded man covered. "Rode out when the shooting started," Miguel Martinez gasped, blood seeping through his fingers. "He's probably halfway to Mexico by now." Jake was about to respond when he heard the thunder of approaching hooves. At least a dozen riders were coming up the canyon at full gallop. Miguel's face broke into a pained grin. "Looks like you're the one in trouble now, Cowboy." The approaching riders weren't more rustlers. They were Apache warriors, their faces painted for war, weapons ready. Jake realized with growing dread that the gunshots had attracted the attention of the very people he'd been trying to avoid. He was trapped in the canyon with wounded rustlers, stolen cattle, and now a war party bearing down on him. Jake's mind raced through his options. He could try to shoot his way out, but, against a dozen Apache warriors, that was suicide. He could surrender, but that might just mean a slower death. The Apache had been fighting white settlers for decades, and mercy wasn't something they were known for showing to armed intruders in their territory. The warriors spread out as they approached, cutting off every possible escape route. Jake recognized the tactical skill immediately. These weren't random raiders. This was an organized war party, and he had stumbled right into their path. The lead warrior, a man with intricate tattoos covering his chest and arms, raised his hand, signaling the others to halt about 50 yards away. For a long moment, nobody moved. Jake stood in the middle of the camp, his gun still in his hand but pointed at the ground. The wounded rustler had gone very quiet, perhaps hoping the Apache wouldn't notice him. The cattle continued grazing peacefully, unaware of the deadly tension surrounding them. The Apache leader said something in his own language, and 2 warriors dismounted. They approached slowly, their weapons ready but not immediately threatening. Jake knew enough about Apache customs to know this was either a good sign or the calm before a very violent storm. "You are far from your people, white man," the leader said in heavily accented English. His voice was calm but carried unmistakable authority. "This is not a safe place for you to be." Jake kept his hands visible and tried to project more confidence than he felt. "I'm tracking cattle thieves," he said, gesturing toward Miguel Martinez. "These men stole my livestock. I was just taking back what belongs to me." The Apache leader's eyes moved to the wounded rustler, then to the body of Black Pete, and, finally, to the cattle. Jake could see him processing the situation, deciding whether Jake was a threat or just an unlucky rancher in the wrong place at the wrong time. "Your cattle thieves brought you into our territory," the leader said after a long pause. "That makes this our concern now." Jake felt his throat go dry. He was completely at their mercy, and everyone present knew it. The Apache could kill him, take his cattle, and no one would ever know what happened to him. His body would bleach in the desert sun, just another victim of the violent frontier. But something unexpected happened. The leader gestured to his warriors, and they began to dismount. Instead of preparing for violence, they seemed to be settling in. Jake watched in confusion as several of the younger warriors began gathering wood for a fire. "We will make camp here tonight," the Apache leader announced. "In the morning, we will decide what to do with you." Jake realized this was probably the best outcome he could hope for. At least he was still alive, and the Apache weren't immediately hostile. But, as the sun began to set over the canyon walls, he couldn't shake the feeling that his real troubles were just beginning. The wounded rustler was looking worse by the hour, and Jake knew that if the man died during the night, the Apache might hold him responsible. As darkness fell over the camp, Jake found himself sitting by a fire with the very people he'd been taught to fear most. The Apache warriors were quiet but not unfriendly. They shared their food with him, and the leader, who introduced himself as Nailnish, seemed genuinely interested in Jake's story about tracking the rustlers. But Jake's attention kept drifting to 2 young girls who had appeared from somewhere in the group. They couldn't have been more than 14 or 15 years old, and they moved through the camp with the quiet efficiency of people much older. Jake noticed they kept glancing in his direction, whispering to each other in their native language. As the night wore on, Jake began to realize that his situation was more complex than a simple encounter with a war party. These Apache weren't just random raiders. They were a family group, traveling with women and children, which suggested they were either moving to a new camp or fleeing from something themselves. The presence of the young girls made Jake think this might be a band of refugees, not warriors looking for a fight. The wounded rustler, Miguel Martinez, was growing weaker as the hours passed. Jake had done what he could to bandage the man's shoulder, but he needed proper medical attention. Jake found himself in the strange position of hoping the man would survive the night, not out of any sympathy for a cattle thief, but because he feared what the Apache might do if they thought Jake was responsible for the man's death. Near midnight, Jake was startled when the 2 young girls approached him. They moved silently, like shadows, and were standing beside him before he realized they were there. One of them, the older of the 2, spoke to him in broken English. "You are not bad man," she said quietly, her dark eyes studying his face intently. "We see this." Jake wasn't sure how to respond. He'd never had a conversation with Apache people before, especially not children. "I'm just trying to get my cattle back," he said softly, not wanting to wake the sleeping warriors around the fire. The second girl, who appeared to be the younger sister, said something in Apache to her companion. The older girl nodded and looked back at Jake. She says you have good spirit. Not like other white men who come here. Jake felt a strange mixture of gratitude and unease. These girls seemed to be taking his measure, deciding something important about him. Their opinion might determine whether he lived to see another sunset. My name is Jake, he whispered. What are your names? The older girl smiled slightly. I am Ayana. This is my sister, Lomesai. Our grandfather is Nailnish. She gestured toward the leader who was sleeping on the other side of the fire. Jake nodded, filing away this information. If these were Nailnish's granddaughters, that explained why they seemed to have some status in the group. It also meant that their opinion of him might carry weight with their grandfather. Ayana reached into a small leather pouch at her waist and pulled out several small items. In the flickering firelight, Jake could see they were various colored stones and what looked like small bones or pieces of carved wood. She and Lomesai whispered together for several minutes, occasionally glancing at Jake. Finally, Ayana looked up at him with serious eyes. We want to do something for you, she said. Something to keep you safe. But, you must promise to remember us if bad things happen. Jake didn't understand what she meant, but something in her tone made him nod. I promise. The two girls moved closer, and Ayana began drawing symbols on Jake's forehead and cheeks with what appeared to be a mixture of crushed berries and clay. The designs were intricate, and she worked with the concentration of someone performing a sacred ritual. Lomesai chanted softly under her breath, her young voice barely audible over the crackling fire. When they finished, both girls studied their work critically. Ayana nodded with satisfaction. Now you carry protection of our people, she said. These marks mean you are friend, not enemy. If you meet other Apache, they will know you are under our protection. Jake touched his face gently, feeling the slightly sticky mixture of the sacred markings. He didn't fully understand the significance of what had just happened, but he sensed it was important. These two young girls had just performed some kind of ceremony that might save his life. As dawn approached, the camp began to stir. Nailnish rose early, as leaders often do, and immediately noticed the markings on Jake's face. He looked at his granddaughters with raised eyebrows, and they spoke to him rapidly in Apache. Jake watched the conversation nervously, unable to understand the words but able to read the body language well enough to know they were explaining what they had done. After several minutes of discussion, Nailnish approached Jake. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't seem angry. My granddaughters have marked you with symbols of protection, he said. They believe you are a man of honor. They have vouched for your character with their own reputations. Jake stood up, feeling the weight of responsibility that came with this unexpected honor. I'm grateful, he said simply. I won't betray their trust. Nailnish studied Jake's face for a long moment. We shall see, he said finally. The test of a man's character comes not in peaceful times, but when difficult choices must be made. Jake had no idea how prophetic those words would prove to be. The morning sun revealed the harsh beauty of the Arizona landscape as the mixed camp prepared to break up. Miguel Martinez had survived the night, though he was weak and pale from blood loss. Nailnish had decided that Jake could take his cattle and leave, but first, there was business to discuss. The wounded man needs help, Nailnish said, gesturing toward Miguel. He cannot ride far in his condition. Jake looked at the rustler who had stolen from him. Every practical instinct told him to leave Miguel behind. The man was a thief and, probably worse. But something about the way Ayana and Lomesai watched him made Jake reconsider. They had trusted him with their protection markings. Perhaps this was the test of character Nailnish had mentioned. I'll take him to the doctor in Tucson, Jake said finally. It's only a day's ride if we go slow. Nailnish nodded approvingly, but Jake caught a look of satisfaction on the faces of the two girls. They had been testing him, and he had passed. As Jake prepared to leave with his recovered cattle and his unwilling patient, Ayana approached him one final time. She pressed a small leather pouch into his hand. Keep this with you always, she said. Inside are sacred stones from our ancestral grounds. If you are ever in great danger, hold them and remember us." Jake tied the pouch to his belt, touched by the gesture. "I'll remember," he promised. The journey to Tucson was difficult. Miguel grew weaker as the day wore on, and Jake had to support him in the saddle for the last several miles. By the time they reached the town's small medical clinic, the rustler was barely conscious. Dr. Edmund Whitmore, the town's only physician, was a gruff but competent man who had seen more than his share of gunshot wounds. He examined Miguel quickly and efficiently. "He'll live," the doctor pronounced, "but he needs rest and proper care. He won't be riding anywhere for at least 2 weeks." Jake arranged for Miguel to be kept under guard at the clinic, then reported the incident to Sheriff Tom Bradley. The sheriff was a practical man who appreciated Jake's honesty about the Apache encounter. "You're lucky to be alive," Bradley said, studying Jake's face with interest. "Those markings on your cheek. I've seen similar ones before. The Apache don't give those to just anyone." Jake touched the faded symbols that Ayanna had painted on his face. They had become lighter throughout the day but were still visible. "2 young girls did this. Said it would offer protection." Sheriff Bradley nodded thoughtfully. "Apache children don't make those decisions lightly. They must have seen something in you that impressed them." He paused, then added more seriously, "You might need that protection sooner than you think." The sheriff's words proved prophetic. Over the next few weeks, tension in the territory escalated dramatically. A rogue band of Apache warriors, led by a fierce war chief named Goyakla, had been conducting increasingly bold raids on white settlements. Unlike the peaceful family group Jake had encountered, these warriors showed no mercy and took no prisoners. The territorial governor, under pressure from Washington and local settlers, had authorized a new military campaign against all Apache bands in the region. Colonel Marcus Whitfield, a career soldier with a reputation for ruthlessness, had arrived with 3 companies of cavalry and orders to clear the territory of hostile Indians by any means necessary. Jake tried to return to his normal routine of running his small ranch, but the escalating conflict made peaceful coexistence impossible. Rumors spread daily of new attacks, burned homesteads, and missing settlers. The territorial newspapers called for total war against the Apache, making no distinction between hostile warriors and peaceful families. 3 weeks after his encounter in the canyon, Jake was in town buying supplies when Sheriff Bradley approached him with troubling news. "Colonel Whitfield wants to see you," the sheriff said. "He's heard about your encounter with that Apache band, and he has questions." Jake found Colonel Whitfield at the Territorial Military Headquarters, a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Tucson. The colonel was exactly what Jake had expected: tall, rigid, with cold gray eyes and the bearing of a man accustomed to absolute authority. "Mr. Morrison," Whitfield said without preamble, "I understand you had recent contact with hostile Apache forces." Jake chose his words carefully. "I encountered a family group while tracking cattle thieves, sir. They weren't hostile." Whitfield's eyes narrowed. "All Apache in this territory are considered hostile under my orders." "You said it was a family group. How many warriors? How many women and children? What was their direction of travel?" Jake felt a chill of unease. The colonel wasn't asking these questions out of curiosity. He was gathering intelligence for a military operation. "I'm not sure I can help you with that information, sir." "Can't or won't?" Whitfield's voice carried a clear threat. "Mr. Morrison, I have authority from the territorial governor to require cooperation from all citizens. Harboring information about hostile Indians is considered an act of treason." Jake thought about Ayanna and Lomesai, about their grandfather Nailnish who had shown him unexpected mercy. These were not the savage raiders the newspapers wrote about. They were a family trying to survive in an increasingly hostile world. "I told you the truth, Colonel. They weren't hostile. They let me leave with my cattle unharmed." Whitfield stood up abruptly, his patience clearly exhausted. "Mr. Morrison, you seem to misunderstand the situation. We are at war. There are no friendly Indians in this territory, only hostiles who haven't been caught yet." He walked to a large map on the wall and pointed to several marked locations. "In the past month, Apache raiders have attacked these settlements.
17 settlers dead, including women and children. 5 homesteads burned to the ground. Dozens of livestock stolen.
Jake studied the map, noting that all the attack sites were at least 50 miles from where he had encountered Nailnish's group. The Apache I met weren't raiders, Colonel. They were refugees.
Refugees? Whitfield laughed coldly. Mr. Morrison, Apache don't become refugees.
They become raiders, or they become corpses.
There is no third option in my territory.
The meeting ended with Jake providing only the most basic information about his encounter. He described the general area where he'd met the Apache but gave no details that could help track them. Whitfield dismissed him with obvious displeasure, but there was little the colonel could do without more specific charges. As Jake left the military headquarters, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just signed someone's death warrant. Whitfield was clearly planning a major operation against Apache bands in the region, and even peaceful groups like Nailnish's family would be considered legitimate targets. That night, Jake lay awake in his small cabin, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with his conscience. He had no way to warn Nailnish about the coming military campaign. Even if he could find the Apache band again, approaching them might put them in even greater danger if he was followed.
His troubled sleep was interrupted before dawn by urgent pounding on his door.
Jake grabbed his rifle and cautiously opened the door to find Sheriff Bradley standing on his porch, his face grim in the lamplight.
"Jake, we've got serious trouble," the sheriff said. "Whitfield's cavalry found an Apache camp yesterday evening. There was a fight." Jake's heart sank. "Nailnish's group?" Bradley nodded gravely. "Looks like it.
The colonel's men hit them at sunset. Most of the warriors were killed in the fighting, including an older man who might have been their leader.
But here's the thing, Jake.
2 young girls are missing from the camp. Whitfield thinks they escaped during the battle, and he's organized search parties to find them."
Jake felt sick to his stomach.
Ayana and Lomesai were alone in the desert, probably terrified, with cavalry patrols hunting them like animals.
What happens if the soldiers find them? Sheriff Bradley's expression grew even more serious.
Whitfield's orders are to take no prisoners.
He considers all Apache to be hostile combatants, regardless of age. Jake understood immediately.
The colonel intended to kill 2 children whose only crime was being born Apache. The same girls who had shown him kindness and marked him with symbols of protection were now running for their lives through the harsh desert.
"I need to find them first," Jake said, his mind already racing through possibilities. "Jake, that's suicide," Bradley warned.
"Whitfield has every trail in 50 miles under patrol. If his men find you helping Apache refugees, he'll shoot you as a traitor."
"I guarantee it."
Jake thought about the small leather pouch Ayana had given him, still tied to his belt. Inside were sacred stones from Apache ancestral grounds, a gift of trust from a child who had seen goodness in a stranger's heart.
He couldn't betray that trust now. "Sheriff, those girls saved my life with their protection markings. I owe them."
Bradley studied Jake's face in the lamplight, noting the faded but still visible symbols on his cheek.
After a long moment, he sighed heavily.
"If you're determined to do this fool thing, at least do it smart. Whitfield's patrols are concentrated in the areas where they think the girls might head toward Mexico. But there's old Apache trails leading north toward the Dragoon Mountains that most white men don't know about."
Jake felt a flicker of hope.
The Dragoon Mountains were rough country, full of hidden canyons and natural caves. If Ayana and Lomesai had managed to reach that area, they might be able to hide indefinitely.
"How long do I have before Whitfield realizes what I'm doing?" "Not long," Bradley admitted.
"The colonel's suspicious of you already after yesterday's meeting.
Once he figures out you're not at your ranch, he'll put 2 and 2 together."
The sheriff paused, then added quietly, "Jake, I can't officially help you with this, but I can promise you won't have to worry about pursuit from my office for 24 hours.
After that, I'll have to do my job." Jake understood.
Bradley was giving him a 1-day head start, risking his own position to help save 2 innocent children.
It would have to be enough.
As Jake prepared for what might be his final journey, he thought about the strange turn his life had taken.
3 weeks ago, he had been a simple rancher tracking cattle thieves.
Now he was about to become a fugitive from territorial authority, risking everything to save two Apache girls he barely knew. But, as he touched the sacred pouch at his belt and felt the faded protection markings on his face, Jake knew he was making the right choice. Sometimes a man's character was indeed tested by difficult choices, just as Nailnish had predicted.
Jake intended to pass that test, no matter the cost.
The hunt was about to begin, and Jake Morrison was determined to reach Ayana and Lomesai before Colonel Whitfield's cavalry could complete their murderous mission. The race against time would test not only Jake's tracking skills but also the depth of his commitment to honor the trust two young girls had placed in him. As the first light of dawn broke over the Arizona territory, Jake saddled his horse and rode out toward the Dragoon Mountains, following trails known only to Apache scouts and the few white men they had trusted with their secrets. Behind him, he could already hear the distant sound of cavalry bugles as Whitfield's search parties prepared for another day of hunting. The final confrontation was approaching, and Jake Morrison was riding straight into the heart of it, guided by nothing more than a promise made to two children around a campfire under the desert stars. Jake pushed his horse hard through the pre-dawn darkness, following ancient Apache trails that wound through the foothills toward the Dragoon Mountains. The paths were barely visible, marked only by occasional stone cairns and subtle signs that most white men would miss entirely. Jake had learned to read these trails from an old Apache scout who had worked for the territorial government before the current hostilities began. As the sun rose higher, Jake found signs that someone had passed this way recently. Broken twigs, disturbed pebbles, and the faint impression of small moccasins in the dust told him he was on the right track. Ayana and Lomesai had come this way, probably during the night after escaping the cavalry attack on their camp. The trail led deeper into the mountains, through narrow canyons and across rocky ridges that would challenge even experienced riders. Jake marveled at the girls' courage and skill. They were traveling on foot through some of the most dangerous terrain in the territory, pursued by armed soldiers, yet they had managed to stay ahead of their pursuers for almost 2 days. Near midday, Jake heard the sound he had been dreading, the distant blast of cavalry bugles echoing off the canyon walls. Whitfield's search parties were getting closer. Jake urged his horse forward, knowing that time was running out. The trail led to a narrow canyon that Jake had never explored before. High walls rose on both sides, creating deep shadows even in the bright sunlight. Jake dismounted and led his horse carefully over the rocky ground, following the faint signs that the girls had passed this way. As he rounded a bend in the canyon, Jake heard a sound that stopped him cold, the unmistakable click of a rifle being cocked. He froze, his hands raised, as a young voice called out in heavily accented English. "Do not move, white man. We have guns pointed at you." Jake recognized Ayana's voice immediately. "It's Jake Morrison," he called back. "I'm here to help you." There was a long pause, then, the sound of whispering voices. Finally, Ayana appeared from behind a large boulder, holding an old rifle that looked too heavy for her small frame. Her face was streaked with dirt and tears, but her eyes blazed with determination. "Jake," she said uncertainly, studying his face. "You still have our protection markings." Jake touched his cheek where the faded symbols were still barely visible. "I told you I would remember." "Are you hurt? Where is Lomesai?" Ayana lowered the rifle slightly. "She is hiding. We have been running since the soldiers attacked our camp." Her voice broke as she continued. "They killed our grandfather. They killed everyone." Jake felt a surge of anger at Colonel Whitfield and his merciless campaign. Nailnish had been a peaceful man, trying to protect his family. His death was murder, not military victory. "I'm here to get you to safety," Jake said gently. "But we need to move fast. The cavalry is close behind me." Ayana called out in Apache, and Lomesai emerged from a hidden crevice in the canyon wall. The younger girl was limping, and Jake could see that her left ankle was swollen and painful. She had been hurt during their escape from the attack. "Can you ride?" Jake asked, looking at Lomesai's injury. "She hurt her foot jumping from the rocks when the shooting started," Ayana explained. "She can walk a little, but not far." Jake made a quick decision.
She'll ride with me. Can you handle my horse while I walk? Ayana nodded confidently.
Despite her youth, she had grown up around horses and was an accomplished rider. Jake helped Lomesai onto his horse, noting how the younger girl tried to hide her pain. These children had incredible courage. As they prepared to leave the canyon, Jake heard something that chilled him to the bone, the sound of many horses approaching at a gallop. The cavalry had found their trail. This way, Ayana whispered urgently, leading them toward what appeared to be a solid rock wall. But, as they got closer, Jake saw that there was a narrow opening, barely wide enough for a horse to pass through. It was so well concealed that it would be invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. They squeezed through the opening just as the cavalry patrol entered the main canyon. Jake held his breath as he heard the soldiers milling around, their voices echoing off the walls as they searched for signs of the fugitives. "Tracks go this way," one soldier called out.
"They can't be far ahead." "Spread out," came the reply in Colonel Whitfield's unmistakable voice. "Search every cave, every crevice. Those Apache brats are here somewhere." Jake felt Lomesai tense in the saddle in front of him. The young girl understood enough English to know that the soldiers were talking about killing them. Jake placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, trying to project a confidence he didn't entirely feel. The hidden passage led to a small circular canyon, completely enclosed by high rock walls. It was a natural fortress, invisible from the outside and accessible only through the concealed entrance. Ancient Apache symbols were carved into the walls, and Jake realized this was a sacred place, used by the tribe for centuries as a refuge during times of danger. "We can hide here," Ayana whispered. "The soldiers will not find this place." Jake wasn't so sure. Colonel Whitfield was a thorough man, and he had Apache scouts working for him who might know about hidden canyons. They needed a better plan than simply hiding and hoping. As if reading his thoughts, Ayana said, "There is another way out of here. A trail that leads to the high peaks. But it is very dangerous, especially for horses." Jake studied the canyon walls, looking for the trail she mentioned. Finally, he spotted it, a narrow ledge that zigzagged up the eastern wall, barely wide enough for a person to walk. It would be impossible for horses, and extremely dangerous for anyone on foot. "How far does that trail go?" Jake asked. "All the way to the top of the mountain," Ayana replied. "From there, we can see for many miles. There are caves up there where we can hide until the soldiers leave." It wasn't much of a plan, but it was better than staying trapped in the canyon. Jake made another difficult decision. "We'll have to leave the horse here. It can't make that climb." Jake removed his saddlebags, taking only essential supplies, water, food, ammunition, and his rifle. He also took the small leather pouch that Ayana had given him weeks ago, making sure it was secure on his belt. Something told him he might need its protection before this was over. The climb up the canyon wall was harrowing. The ledge was often only 2 feet wide, with a sheer drop to the canyon floor below. Jake went first, testing each step carefully, while Ayana helped her injured sister navigate the treacherous path. Several times, loose rocks gave way under their feet, clattering down into the canyon below. They were about halfway up when they heard voices from the hidden canyon below. The cavalry had found the concealed entrance. Jake peered over the edge and saw Colonel Whitfield himself leading a squad of soldiers into the sacred refuge. "Fresh horse droppings," one of the soldiers reported. "They were here recently." Whitfield studied the canyon walls with the eye of an experienced military tactician. "There has to be another way out of here," he said. "Indians don't trap themselves in dead ends." His gaze swept upward, and Jake ducked back quickly, hoping they hadn't been spotted. The climb became a race against time. Jake could hear the soldiers below, searching for the trail they were using. It would only be a matter of time before someone looked up and saw them on the ledge. Lomesai was struggling with the climb, her injured ankle making each step painful. Ayana stayed close to her sister, offering encouragement in whispered Apache words. Jake admired their determination. These girls had already endured more hardship than most adults ever faced, yet they kept going without complaint. They were nearly at the top when disaster struck.
A section of the ledge, weakened by recent rains, gave way under Jake's weight. He scrambled frantically, grabbing for handholds as rocks tumbled into the void below. Ayana lunged forward and grabbed his wrist, her small hands somehow finding the strength to keep him from falling. The sound of falling rocks echoed through the canyon, immediately drawing the attention of the soldiers below. Shouts erupted as the cavalry spotted them on the ledge. "There they are!" Whitfield's voice boomed from below. "On the eastern wall." Rifle shots rang out, bullets chipping rock dangerously close to the climbers. Jake hauled himself back onto the ledge and pushed the girls forward. "Move! Don't look back!" The final stretch to the top was a nightmare of flying bullets and crumbling rock. Jake used his own body to shield the girls as much as possible, feeling the wind of several bullets that came uncomfortably close. They reached the summit just as a particularly heavy volley sent stone fragments showering around them. At the top of the mountain, Jake got his first clear view of their situation. The landscape stretched out below them for miles in every direction. He could see multiple columns of cavalry spread across the territory, all converging on the mountain. Colonel Whitfield had committed a significant portion of his forces to hunting down two young girls. "The caves are this way," Ayana said, pointing toward a cluster of rocky outcroppings near the mountain's peak. "We can hide there." As they made their way toward the caves, Jake noticed something troubling. Smoke was rising from several points across the valley below. The cavalry wasn't just searching for Ayana and Lomesai. They were conducting a systematic campaign of destruction, burning anything that might provide shelter or supplies to Apache refugees. The caves Ayana had mentioned were actually a complex network of interconnected chambers carved into the mountain by centuries of wind and water. Ancient Apache pictographs covered the walls, telling stories of hunts, battles, and spiritual ceremonies. This was clearly another sacred site, a place where the tribe had sought refuge for generations. As they settled into the deepest chamber, Jake realized the full magnitude of their situation. They were trapped on top of a mountain, surrounded by hundreds of cavalry soldiers. Lomesai's injury was getting worse, and their water and food supplies were limited. Even if they managed to avoid capture for a few days, they would eventually be forced to surrender or die of thirst. Jake studied the pictographs on the cave walls, trying to understand the stories they told. One series of images seemed to show a great battle, with Apache warriors defending their homeland against invaders. Another depicted a spiritual ceremony, with figures dancing around a sacred fire. But it was the final set of pictographs that caught Jake's attention. They showed what appeared to be a negotiation or peace meeting, with Apache and white figures standing together under symbols that looked like the protection markings Ayana had painted on his face. "What do these pictures mean?" Jake asked, pointing to the peace meeting scene. Ayana studied the ancient drawings carefully. "It is the story of the first treaty," she said. "Long ago, when my great-grandfather was young, the Apache made peace with white soldiers. For a time, there was no fighting." Jake felt a spark of hope. "Are there other white men who respect Apache treaties? People who might help us?" Ayana looked uncertain. "There was an Indian agent in Tucson, a man named Henderson. He spoke for our people when there were disputes with settlers. But I do not know if he is still there." Jake remembered hearing about Agent Henderson. The man had a reputation for fairness and had successfully negotiated several peaceful settlements between Apache bands and white settlers. If Henderson was still in the territory, he might be their only hope of ending this crisis without more bloodshed. But reaching Henderson would mean getting off the mountain and traveling 60 miles to Tucson while being hunted by the entire cavalry regiment. It seemed impossible, yet it was the only plan that offered any hope of saving the girls' lives. As night fell over the mountain, Jake made a decision that would determine all their fates. He was going to attempt something so dangerous that it bordered on suicide. He would leave the girls hidden in the caves and try to reach Tucson alone, traveling at night to avoid the cavalry patrols. If he could find Agent Henderson and convince the man to intervene with Colonel Whitfield, there might be a chance to save Ayana and Lomesai. "I'm going for help," he told the girls as they huddled together in the cold mountain cave. "Stay hidden here no matter what happens. If I'm not back in 3 days, try to make your way to Mexico." Ayanna looked at him with wise eyes that seemed too old for her young face. "You are risking your life for us," she said quietly. "Why would you do this for Apache girls?" Jake thought about her question for a long moment. "Because you trusted me when you didn't have to," he said finally. "Because your grandfather showed me mercy when he could have killed me. Because what's happening here isn't justice. It's just murder." Lomesai, who had been quiet most of the day, spoke up in her halting English. "If you do not come back, we will remember you in our prayers to the Great Spirit." As Jake prepared to begin his desperate journey down the mountain, he touched the sacred pouch at his belt and looked one last time at the faded protection markings on his reflection in a small pool of water. Tomorrow would determine whether the kindness these girls had shown him would be repaid with salvation or tragedy. Jake began his descent from the mountain under the cover of darkness, moving like a ghost through terrain he had never seen before. Every shadow could hide a cavalry sentry, every sound might betray his location to the soldiers camped below. He had left his rifle with the girls, keeping only his revolver and knife. Speed and stealth were more important than firepower for this mission. The first few miles were the most dangerous. Jake had to circle around 3 different cavalry encampments, crawling on his belly through thorny brush and rocky outcroppings to avoid detection. Each camp had sentries posted, their cigarettes glowing like fireflies in the darkness. Jake counted at least 60 soldiers spread across the base of the mountain. Colonel Whitfield was taking no chances. By dawn, Jake had managed to put 10 miles between himself and the mountain, but he was exhausted and his water was running low. He found shelter in a small cave and tried to rest during the daylight hours, knowing that traveling in daylight would be suicide with so many patrols in the area. As he dozed fitfully in the cramped cave, Jake's mind wandered back to Ayanna and Lomesai, alone and frightened in their mountain refuge. Lomesai's ankle was getting worse, and they had very little food. If his mission failed, those 2 brave girls would die slowly of starvation and thirst, assuming the cavalry didn't find them first. The thought drove Jake to push himself harder than he had ever pushed before. When darkness fell again, he continued his journey toward Tucson, following dry creek beds and animal trails that would be invisible to mounted patrols. His boots were wearing thin, and his feet were bloody from the rocky terrain, but he forced himself to keep moving. On the second night, Jake's luck almost ran out. He was crossing a wide valley when he heard the sound of horses approaching from multiple directions. A cavalry patrol was conducting a night sweep of the area, using lanterns to search for signs of Apache refugees. Jake dove into a cluster of prickly pear cactus, ignoring the thorns that pierced his clothing and skin. The soldiers passed so close that Jake could smell their horses and hear their quiet conversation. They were tired and frustrated, having spent days searching for 2 young girls who seemed to have vanished into thin air. One soldier complained about Colonel Whitfield's obsession with finding the Apache children. "Seems like a waste of good men," the soldier muttered. "Chasing kids through the mountains when there's real hostile bands out there doing real damage." "Keep your voice down," another soldier replied. "Whitfield's got his reasons. Those girls are the last survivors of that band. He wants to make sure there's no one left to tell tales about what happened at the camp." Jake's blood ran cold as he understood the implication. Whitfield wasn't just hunting Ayanna and Lomesai to prevent future raids. He was trying to eliminate witnesses to what might have been a massacre of innocent people. The colonel's attack on Nailnish's peaceful family group hadn't been a legitimate military action. It had been murder, and the 2 girls were the only ones who could testify to what really happened. After the patrol passed, Jake continued his desperate journey with renewed urgency. This wasn't just about saving 2 children anymore. It was about exposing a war crime and bringing a murderous officer to justice. Jake reached the outskirts of Tucson late on the second night, but his trials were far from over. The town was under military control, with checkpoints on every road and patrols in the streets. Colonel Whitfield had clearly anticipated that someone might try to reach the civilian authorities, and he had taken precautions to prevent it. Jake hid in the ruins of an old mission on the edge of town, watching the patrols and trying to figure out how to reach Agent Henderson's office. The Indian Agency building was in the center of town, surrounded by military checkpoints. Getting there undetected would require careful timing and no small amount of luck.
As dawn approached, Jake made his move.
He had noticed that the patrol patterns changed during the shift change at sunrise. For about 10 minutes, there would be gaps in the coverage as tired soldiers were replaced by fresh ones. It was a small window, but it might be enough. Jake slipped through the narrow alleyways of Tucson, staying in the shadows and avoiding the main streets where cavalry troops were billeted. His Apache-style movement skills, learned during years of tracking in the wilderness, served him well in the urban environment. He moved from shadow to shadow, timing his advance to coincide with the movements of the patrols.
The Indian Agency building was a modest adobe structure with a small sign identifying it as the Bureau of Indian Affairs Territorial Office.
Jake circled the building carefully, noting that there were no soldiers stationed directly outside.
Apparently, Whitfield either didn't know about Agent Henderson or didn't consider him a threat.
Jake slipped around to the back of the building and tried the rear door. It was locked, but the lock was old and simple. Using his knife, Jake managed to work the mechanism open without making much noise. He stepped inside and immediately knew he was in the right place. The walls were covered with maps of Apache territories and photographs of tribal leaders, including several of Nailnish.
"Can I help you?"
Jake spun around to find himself facing a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes. The man didn't seem particularly alarmed by Jake's sudden appearance, which suggested he was used to unusual visitors.
"Are you Agent Henderson?" Jake asked. "I am." "And you are Jake Morrison, unless I miss my guess." "I've been expecting you for 2 days now." Jake was stunned. "Expecting me? How could you possibly?"
Henderson smiled grimly.
"Sheriff Bradley sent word that you might be coming."
He also sent some very interesting information about Colonel Whitfield's recent military actions.
Henderson gestured for Jake to sit down.
"Tell me about the girls you're trying to save." Jake quickly related the entire story, from his first encounter with Nailnish's family to the girls' current predicament in the mountain caves.
Henderson listened intently, occasionally asking for clarification on specific details.
When Jake finished, the agent sat back in his chair with a troubled expression. "This confirms my worst fears about Whitfield's campaign," Henderson said. "I've been receiving reports from Apache scouts and friendly tribal members about attacks on peaceful family groups. The colonel seems to believe that killing women and children will end Apache resistance by eliminating future generations of warriors."
"Can you stop him?" Jake asked desperately.
"Those girls will die if someone doesn't intervene soon."
Henderson stood up and walked to a large safe in the corner of his office.
He withdrew a thick folder of documents and spread them on his desk. "I've been gathering evidence of Whitfield's war crimes for weeks," he said.
"Attacks on peaceful camps, execution of prisoners, destruction of sacred sites. But I needed witnesses who could testify about specific incidents." Jake understood immediately. "Ayana and Lomesai saw the attack on their camp.
They know their grandfather and the others weren't hostile warriors. They were just families trying to survive."
"Exactly."
"Their testimony, combined with what I already have, would be enough to bring charges against Whitfield in federal court.
But first, we have to get them to safety."
Henderson began writing rapidly on official letterhead. "I'm preparing an order for the immediate cessation of military operations against Apache civilians. As the federal Indian agent for this territory, I have the authority to override military commanders when their actions violate treaty obligations."
"Will Whitfield obey such an order?" Jake asked doubtfully. Henderson's expression grew stern.
"He will if it's delivered by a federal marshal with a company of U.S. Army regulars to enforce it. The colonel has been operating under territorial authority, but Indian affairs are a federal matter. I can supersede his command." Jake felt hope stirring for the first time in days.
"How long will it take to arrange that?"
"The federal marshal is already on his way here with orders to investigate reports of unauthorized military actions against peaceful Apache bands.
He should arrive this evening with sufficient force to arrest Whitfield if necessary." Henderson handed Jake the official order he had just completed.
"In the meantime, this document should be enough to protect the girls temporarily." But someone needs to deliver it to Whitfield and make sure he understands the consequences of disobeying a federal order. Jake took the document, reading it quickly.
It was written in formal legal language that left no room for misinterpretation.
Colonel Whitfield was ordered to immediately cease all operations against Apache non-combatants and to provide safe passage for any peaceful family groups wishing to relocate to designated reservation lands. "I'll take this to him," Jake said, folding the document carefully.
Henderson shook his head. "That would be suicide.
Whitfield knows you've been helping the girls.
He'll shoot you on sight and claim you were resisting arrest. Then, how do we deliver it?"
Henderson smiled for the first time since their conversation began.
"We don't deliver it.
We have it read aloud from the steps of the territorial courthouse at noon today, with the entire town as witnesses. Under federal law, public proclamation of an Indian agency order has the same legal effect as personal delivery."
Jake was amazed by the agent's tactical thinking.
By making the order public, Henderson would force Whitfield to either comply or openly defy federal authority in front of hundreds of witnesses. Either way, the colonel's ability to continue his murderous campaign would be severely compromised.
What about the girls? They're trapped on that mountain with limited supplies.
Once the order is public, Whitfield will have to allow them safe passage or risk federal charges.
But, you're right to be concerned.
Even if everything goes perfectly, it will take time for word to reach them, and they may not trust any soldiers who approach their hiding place. Henderson walked to his window and looked out at the town square where preparations were already underway for the noon proclamation. "There's only one way to ensure their safety," he said thoughtfully. "Someone they trust needs to return to the mountain and bring them down personally."
Jake stood up, understanding what Henderson was suggesting. "I'll go back for them as soon as the order is read."
"No," Henderson said firmly.
"Once you show yourself publicly, Whitfield will have his men watching for you. You'll never make it out of town alive." Henderson paused, considering alternatives. "But there might be another way."
The agent walked back to his desk and withdrew another document from his files. "I have here a federal warrant for the arrest of Miguel Martinez, the cattle thief you wounded during your encounter with Nailnish's band. He's been in the town clinic for weeks, but he's finally well enough to travel. Dr. Whitmore has been asking when someone will come to transport him to trial."
Jake didn't immediately see the connection. What does that have to do with getting the girls to safety?
Henderson's eyes gleamed with cunning.
"Miguel Martinez is the only living witness to your original encounter with Nailnish's family.
His testimony could prove that the Apache band was peaceful and that Whitfield's attack was unjustified.
The federal marshal will want to question Martinez as soon as he arrives in town. But, how does that help Ayana and Lomesai?"
"Think about it," Henderson said. "Martinez knows the location of Nailnish's camp because he was there when you encountered the Apache.
He might also know about the mountain hiding places that Apache families use in times of danger. If we could convince him to guide a rescue party." Jake shook his head. "Martinez is a thief and, probably worse. Why would he help Apache children?"
Henderson smiled grimly. "Because Miguel Martinez is facing federal charges for cattle theft, crossing territorial borders with stolen livestock, and interfering with military operations. He's looking at 20 years in a federal prison. But if he were to cooperate with federal authorities in exposing war crimes and helping rescue innocent children, well, that might significantly reduce his sentence."
Jake began to see the brilliance of Henderson's plan. Martinez had every reason to cooperate if it meant avoiding decades in prison.
And, as someone who had been present during Jake's encounter with the Apache, he could provide crucial testimony about the peaceful nature of Nailnish's family group.
"Do you think he'll agree to it?" Henderson was already putting on his coat. "Let's go ask him."
"But, first, we need to make sure he understands exactly what's at stake. For him, for those girls, and for the future of Apache relations in this territory." As they prepared to leave the Indian Agency office, Jake touched the sacred pouch at his belt and thought about the promise he had made to two frightened children in a mountain cave. Help was coming, but whether it would arrive in time remained to be seen. The next few hours would determine whether his desperate gamble to save Ayanna and Lomesai would succeed or end in tragedy for everyone involved. Agent Henderson and Jake found Miguel Martinez sitting up in bed at Dr. Whitmore's clinic, looking much healthier than when Jake had last seen him. The wounded rustler's eyes narrowed when he recognized Jake, but he listened carefully as Henderson explained the situation.
"So let me understand this," Martinez said after hearing the proposal. "You want me to help rescue two Apache girls from the same band that was there when this cowboy shot me?"
Henderson leaned forward in his chair. "Miguel, you're facing serious federal charges. But, more importantly, you're the only witness who can prove that band was peaceful. If Colonel Whitfield's actions were justified, you have nothing to worry about. But, if they constituted war crimes against innocent people, your testimony could be the difference between justice and a cover-up."
Martinez was quiet for a long time, studying Jake's face. Finally, he spoke. "I remember those girls. They were just kids, maybe 14 or 15 years old. They brought me water when I was bleeding, even though I was a stranger who had stolen from their friend." He looked directly at Jake. "You could have left me to die in that canyon, but you didn't. I owe you for that." Dr. Whitmore, who had been listening from across the room, spoke up. "Miguel, those children are in terrible danger.
From what I understand, they're injured, alone, and running out of supplies. Even if politics and justice don't motivate you, surely simple human decency should."
Martinez made his decision. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Henderson quickly outlined the plan.
At noon, he would read the federal order from the courthouse steps, officially commanding Colonel Whitfield to cease operations against Apache civilians. While the colonel was dealing with that public challenge to his authority, Martinez would guide a small rescue party to the mountain where the girls were hiding.
"The problem is getting past Whitfield's patrols," Jake pointed out. "He has the entire area surrounded." Martinez smiled grimly. "I know these mountains better than most people realize. There are old mining trails that the cavalry doesn't know about.
If we move fast and stay off the main routes, we can reach the girls before Whitfield even knows we're there."
Henderson checked his pocket watch. "It's almost 11. We need to move quickly. Miguel, how long will it take you to reach the mountain?"
"If we leave immediately and push hard, we can be there by late afternoon. Coming back down with the girls will take longer, especially if one of them is injured."
Henderson nodded. "That should give us time."
The federal marshal is expected to arrive around sunset with enough soldiers to take control of the situation. If you can get the girls off that mountain before dark, we can have them under federal protection by nightfall."
As they prepared to leave the clinic, Dr. Whitmore approached Jake with a medical bag. "Take this with you.
From what you've described, the younger girl's ankle needs proper attention. There's laudanum in there for pain and clean bandages for dressing wounds."
Jake accepted the medical supplies gratefully.
Every detail might make the difference between success and failure.
The noon proclamation at the courthouse drew a huge crowd.
Word had spread throughout Tucson that something significant was happening, and hundreds of people gathered to hear Agent Henderson read the federal order. Jake watched from a concealed position as Henderson's strong voice carried across the square, officially commanding Colonel Whitfield to cease all operations against Apache non-combatants. Whitfield himself was present, standing with a group of his officers near the courthouse steps.
Jake could see the colonel's face growing redder with each word of the proclamation.
When Henderson finished reading, Whitfield stepped forward to respond.
"This order exceeds federal authority," Whitfield declared loudly.
"I am conducting legitimate military operations against hostile Indians under territorial authorization. No Indian agent has the right to interfere with military necessity." Henderson had anticipated this response. "Colonel, you are operating in violation of federal treaties with the Apache people. The families you've been attacking are protected under the Treaty of Apache Pass, which specifically guarantees safe passage for non-combatants seeking to relocate to designated lands."
The crowd murmured as they witnessed this unprecedented confrontation between federal and territorial authority.
Jake could see that public opinion was shifting in favor of the Indian agent. Most of the townspeople were decent folks who had no stomach for making war on children. While Whitfield argued publicly with Henderson, Jake and Martinez slipped out of town using back alleys and little-known trails. Martinez proved to be as good as his word, leading them along mining paths that wound through the mountains without encountering a single cavalry patrol.
"How do you know about these trails?" Jake asked as they climbed steadily toward the high peaks. Martinez was quiet for a moment before answering. "My grandfather was a prospector in these mountains 30 years ago. He made friends with the Apache because they knew where to find water and safe passage. He taught me to respect their knowledge of this land." Jake was surprised by this revelation.
He had assumed Martinez was just another opportunistic criminal, but perhaps there was more to the man's story than he had realized. They reached the base of the mountain where Ayana and Lomesai were hiding by mid-afternoon, but getting to the cave system would require the same dangerous climb that Jake had made days earlier.
Martinez studied the rock face with an experienced eye.
"There's an easier way up," he said, pointing to a different section of the mountain. "An old mining trail that connects to the same cave network. It's longer but less exposed." Jake was amazed by Martinez's knowledge of the terrain. The rustler led them up a winding path that had been carved by miners decades earlier, following natural ledges and switchbacks that made the climb much safer than the route Jake had used before. As they approached the cave entrance, Jake called out softly in the few Apache words he had learned.
"Ayana. Lomesai. It's Jake Morrison. I've brought help."
The response was immediate. Ayana appeared at the cave mouth, her rifle ready but her face showing relief at seeing Jake return.
"Jake. We thought you were not coming back."
Jake quickly introduced Martinez and explained their plan to get the girls to safety. Lomesai emerged from the cave, limping badly but smiling for the first time since Jake had known her. Dr. Whitmore's medical supplies allowed Jake to properly bandage her ankle and give her something for the pain.
"Can you make the climb down?" Jake asked, examining Lomesai's injury.
"I can do it," the young girl said with determination that reminded Jake of her grandfather's courage. The descent from the mountain was nerve-wracking but successful. Martinez's knowledge of the old mining trails allowed them to avoid the areas where cavalry patrols were concentrated. As the sun began to set, they reached the outskirts of Tucson just as a column of federal soldiers rode into town. The federal marshal, a stern-faced man named William Patterson, wasted no time in asserting his authority. Jake watched from a distance as Patterson confronted Colonel Whitfield in front of the courthouse, presenting federal warrants for the colonel's arrest on charges of conducting unauthorized military operations against peaceful Indian populations.
"By what authority do you dare to arrest a territorial military commander?" Whitfield demanded.
Marshal Patterson's voice carried clearly across the square. "By the authority of the United States federal government, which has exclusive jurisdiction over Indian affairs. You are under arrest for violation of federal treaties, conduct unbecoming an officer, and murder of non-combatants." The confrontation ended with Whitfield in federal custody and his regiment placed under the temporary command of a federal officer who immediately ordered all operations against Apache civilians to cease.
Agent Henderson's plan had worked perfectly.
That evening, in the safety of the Indian Agency office, Jake watched as Ayana and Lomesai gave their testimony about the attack on their family's camp. Their accounts, combined with Martinez's witness testimony about the peaceful nature of the Apache band, provided the evidence needed to ensure that Colonel Whitfield would face trial for his crimes.
"What happens to the girls now?" Jake asked Agent Henderson.
"They'll be relocated to the Apache reservation lands in New Mexico, where they have relatives who can care for them. The federal government will provide transportation and supplies to help them start new lives."
Jake felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness.
The girls were safe, but they had lost their family and their traditional way of life. Still, they were alive, and in time they might find peace and happiness in their new circumstances. As Jake prepared to return to his ranch, Ayana approached him one final time. She carried a small leather pouch similar to the one she had given him weeks earlier. "This is for you to remember us," she said, pressing the pouch into his hands. "Inside are sacred stones from the mountain where you saved our lives. They will bring you good fortune and protect you from harm."
Jake accepted the gift with genuine emotion.
"I'll treasure it always," he said. "And I'll never forget what you and your sister taught me about courage and kindness."
Lomesai stepped forward and spoke in her careful English. "You are now part of our family in spirit.
Wherever we go, we will tell our children and their children about Jake Morrison, the cowboy who risked everything to save two Apache girls." Miguel Martinez, who had been quietly observing the emotional farewell, approached Jake as the girls said their final goodbyes.
"I want to thank you," he said,
"for saving my life in that canyon, and for giving me a chance to do something decent for once.
Agent Henderson says my cooperation will reduce my sentence significantly. I might actually have a chance to start over when I get out."
Jake shook Martinez's hand. "We all deserve a chance to start over," he said.
"Make the most of yours."
As Jake rode home to his ranch under the stars of the Arizona Territory, he reflected on the incredible journey that had begun with tracking cattle thieves and ended with saving two innocent children from a madman's war. The sacred pouches at his belt and the faded protection markings on his face were visible reminders of the bond he had forged with people he had once been taught to fear. The next morning, Jake found Sheriff Bradley waiting on his porch with a cup of coffee and the latest edition of the Tucson newspaper.
The headline read, "Federal Marshal Arrests Territorial Colonel Apache Children Rescued from Military Persecution."
"Quite a story," Bradley said, offering Jake the newspaper. "Though I noticed they don't mention a certain rancher who risked his neck to make it all possible." Jake accepted the coffee and sat down on his porch steps.
"That's fine by me, Sheriff. I didn't do it for recognition."
Bradley studied Jake's face, noting the faded but still visible Apache protection markings.
"Those girls really made an impression on you, didn't they?"
Jake touched the sacred pouches at his belt and looked out across his small ranch toward the distant mountains where Ayana and Lomesai had hidden in the caves.
"They taught me something important," he said thoughtfully.
"Sometimes the people we're told to fear are the ones who understand honor and courage better than anyone else."
Sheriff Bradley nodded approvingly. "The territorial governor is talking about offering you a reward for your part in exposing Whitfield's crimes.
Seems there's money appropriated for citizens who help prevent Indian wars."
Jake shook his head. "I don't want any reward, Sheriff.
Knowing those girls are safe is payment enough." As Bradley rode back to town, Jake began the daily routine of caring for his cattle and maintaining his ranch.
But everything felt different now.
The protection markings on his face and the sacred stones in his pouches connected him to something larger than his own small piece of land. He had become part of a story that transcended the boundaries between Apache and white, between enemy and friend. Years later, when travelers would ask Jake Morrison about the faded marks on his face and the Apache pouches he always wore, he would tell them the true story of two young girls who saved his life with their kindness, and how he had tried to repay that debt by saving theirs. It was a story about the courage to do what's right even when it's dangerous, about the bonds that can form between people who seem to have nothing in common, and about the redemption that comes from choosing compassion over fear. The Apache girls had marked Jake Morrison with symbols of protection, and, in return, he had given them something equally precious, the knowledge that there were still white men who valued justice over vengeance, and who would risk everything to protect the innocent. In a time and place where such men were rare, Jake Morrison had proven that the cowboy code of honor could extend beyond the boundaries of race and culture to embrace all people who shared a common humanity. The story of Jake Morrison and the Apache girls became legend in the Arizona Territory, passed down through generations as an example of how courage, kindness, and determination could overcome even the darkest prejudices of the Old West. It was proof that sometimes, in the most unlikely circumstances, enemies could become family, and strangers could become protectors of each other's sacred trust.